All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Norbert Michel, Vice President at the Cato Institute and Director of the Institute's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. He's also the author of this excellent book, Crushing Capitalism: How Populist Policies Are Threatening the American Dream. Welcome to Free the Economy, Norbert.
Thanks so much. I sure appreciate it.
All right, and of course, Crushing Capitalism is available at all your finer booksellers everywhere. Um, so I'll start with the first easy question we always have for authors, which is why did you write this book?
I love that one actually. I this started sort of out of nowhere. I along a good while back, I was at the Heritage Foundation before I was at Cato, and somebody asked me to look at this thing that one of our other analysts was trying to sort of promote that there had been this horrible income stagnation. And I thought, what in the world is that about? That just doesn't fit with anything I've ever seen. So I just started digging into that. And then the next thing you know, uh, we had sort of a populist movement where that income stagnation story was the key. And I really felt like there were a lot of people, whether they were pundits or analysts or whatever, who were really just lying about the data and misusing the data. And it sounds a little geeky, but nothing really gets me as upset as that. Um, so, so that was the main push, really, to fight back against that and to just sort of set the record straight. Because there's been an enormous amount of income growth.
Mhm.
Um, and people use all kinds of different versions of this, right? We get these like sort of like, well, there were these little periods of stagnation, or were there these pockets of stagnation, and all of that misses the point because it broadly speaking, across the income distribution, across the nation, you have had enormous income growth in the last 5 decades. It's really nothing short of amazing how much it is. And within that sort of national income growth, you always could find pockets where people didn't do as well, or sub periods where people didn't do as well. But the overall trend is just phenomenal. So that was the main driver for me.
Right. And so these, again, we sort of shorthand tend to talk about people who you're responding to here as like economic populists, sometimes as nationalists, different terminology. Sometimes, a lot of times in politics, people have different terms for their side than other people
Right.
have for that side. But populist is a pretty common term. So
Yeah.
a lot of populists who think we need more government intervention in the economy to solve this problem of supposedly, stagnating incomes for American workers. Uh,
Right.
in recent years, they spent a lot of effort trying to convince Americans, like you said, that they're either poorer or at least they're no better off than Americans were 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, sometimes.
Yeah.
There's
Well,
again varying degrees to which they claim the stagnation has been happening.
yeah.
Sometimes it's just in the past 15 years, sometimes it's almost 100 years. And
Yeah.
so when it comes to the data, again, something you're interested in and passionate about and know a lot about, give us just sort of like low level weeds version of, well, how do we know? Like, how do we know if they're right or not?
Okay. Low level. So, um, if you look at the past several decades and we look at household income, and whether we account for changes in household size and composition or not, you see a lot of growth there. For example, what you might find, depending on how you cut it, is that the proportion of households earning under $35,000 a year has shrunk. The proportion earning between 35 and 100 has increased a little bit, but the proportion earning more than 100,000 has skyrocketed. It's more than tripled.
And these are all like real numbers that are adjusted for inflation, right?
Correct. Just this is in terms of real growth. So that's one way to look at it. And then just to give you sort of like my super summary level of the whole thing. There are all kinds of ways to look at income, look at wages, look at compensation, look at consumption, um, and to adjust for inflation and different periods that we can examine. And basically, what I'm showing, and I go through this in the book in a lot of detail, but the quick version is this: if think of it as 10 different ways to do it. Well, out of those 10 different ways to look at it, nine and a half show everything is awesome.
Mhm.
And there's like this one little piece, maybe, that shows maybe things weren't so awesome. Well, that's what those folks the populists keep focusing on. And they're misusing that as well, really. But that's kind of what is going on here.
Right. So this is something that I think frustrates a lot of normal people who are not experts, who are not economists, and don't
Hmm.
sort through Bureau of Labor Statistics spreadsheets for a living, which is they just sort of assume that there's an answer, right? Not 10 answers or 50
Right,
answers.
right,
That there's just a number in a graph somewhere that says
right.
either Americans have more money or they don't, and that you're right. And so one, I think it's obviously it's a realistic it's a reasonable response to say no, actually there's multiple ways to measure these things, and there's some
Yeah,
conflict about which is the most relevant, um, but it also makes it harder to
it
argue.
does. It does.
Instead of saying that number is wrong, this other one number is the perfectly right one,
Right.
um, even when
Unfortunately.
you've got a strong case.
Yeah. And people who are not really used to using statistics, like it's fine, but I hope that people can kind of come along and see that really what I'm saying is actually building a stronger case, because no matter how you cut the data, it looks pretty good, or really good, in fact. And look, we have an economy, a nation of over 330 million people. It's huge. And, if you look at things relative to the rest of the world, it's huge, and it's also incredibly wealthy. So high income earners as well. It's just we're there's unfortunately there's always going to be ways to compare. If I say wage income is the way to go, somebody's going to say, well, no, total compensation is the way to go. If I say, okay, total compensation is fine, they're going to say, well, no, you have to look at this wage category. And then if I say, well, okay, if that I'm all right with that wage category, but you have to look at this time frame, then they'll say, no, you have to look at this time frame. And that's kind of the game that's been being played.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's sort of like I think some of these guys should get jobs at soccer stadiums because they're really good at moving goalposts.
Yes,
Right. There's always
yes,
there's always some other measure that's the real one. Well, this other one, this
that's right.
27th one is the one that shows things
That's
are
right.
secretly terrible.
Oh,
Um,
that's right.
and
It's
so
frustrating as hell.
many of a lot of the critics who we're talking about also claim that trade is a huge aspect of this, and that the freer trade we have somehow the worse things are for Americans. And
So,
that's obviously a huge deal right now, since a lot of the current administration's economic policy is built on a
yeah.
tariff regime where tariffs are much higher than they have been, uh, and that's supposedly going to be good for American workers. But there's again, as you like, you are the one who has done this like deep dive for us in the book, but looking at decades worth of economic studies, and business school research, that there's a pretty good relationship between free trade, expanding free trade, and
Yeah.
rising living standards in the countries that have
No, that's right.
embraced it. So where, it seems like some of the populist rhetoric about protecting American jobs is really kind of emotional, and it's understandable. People have strong emotions about it, but it seems to kind of run into a wall of reality when you look at all of the evidence that lower
That's right.
tariff, freer trade is associated with shared prosperity.
That's right. I hate to use a purely scientific analogy, but that's kind of what's happened. If you bombard the question with hundreds of different studies from hundreds of different angles, and you keep getting the same answer, that's a huge body of evidence in favor of whatever that outcome is, right? And that's really what we have. Like this trade deficit stuff all of a sudden has been revived, and I say revived because this is as old as the hills. I mean, this dates back to, like, I don't know, at least the 1600s, I think, where if we have a trade deficit with a country, it's bad. Somehow it's bad. But that has been so thoroughly debunked and just obliterated. It just is nonsensical. 100%, 100% nonsensical. It doesn't matter if we have a trade deficit. It's not a bad thing. That's just an accounting concept. It doesn't mean a damn thing, other than when we use that accounting framework, a lot of people are sending a lot of money here. So it's I don't know what price we have to pay to get out of continually going over these things, but apparently it's pretty high,
Yeah, I mean it's funny.
unfortunately.
Paul Krugman wrote a book a few years ago about called something like "Arguing with Zombies," where he claims that he's had to refight all these arguments about economics that have supposedly been settled. But I feel like someone with slightly different perspectives than Paul Krugman could easily write the same book, right, about how
Right.
they're having to like refight debates that
Oh yeah.
we won 7 times over the past 200 years. Um, what? So one of the most interesting parts of the book, I think, is the chapter on immigration. Again, next to tariffs, probably the number two most high-profile issue right now when it
Yes.
comes to
Yes.
economics.
And always controversial.
And so at a very kind of like basic level, again, I'm really trying to sort of normie code this discourse and see like what is the average person thinking about this. It is, it's obviously it's deeply ingrained in the minds of a lot of people, even people
Right.
who don't claim to have any expertise about economics, that a lot of immigrants coming from low wage countries is going to undermine earnings for American workers. That
Right.
just, Tucker Carlson says it. Bernie Sanders has been saying it for 40 years. Um, and that's just going to, it's really tough for, say, high school or even high school dropout American workers to compete with immigrants from lower wage countries.
Yeah.
But again, there's a lot of economic research that doesn't actually support that conclusion.
That's
That,
right.
among other
Uh,
things, says, immigrants create a bigger market
yeah.
for stuff, right? They buy stuff too, and they create a bigger market. They don't necessarily drive down wages. Otherwise, every large country would be a low wage country, right?
That's right.
It's possible to have a large workforce and high wages, and we're the best possible example of that. So, how does that sort of intuitive assumption, which I think is intuitive, uh,
Mhm.
how does that run into what your stack of studies tells us?
My so most of my review of the literature, my stack of studies, supports the idea that labor markets adjust very rapidly, and the other effects, the non-direct wage competition effects from an increase in immigration outweigh those competitive effects that put downward pressure on wages, and you don't end up with lower wages. Um, Overall, if I had to say anything, I would say that the bulk of the evidence shows that where there are any wage effects, they're incredibly small. We're talking about like 30 cents for every $1,000. And that's being generous. Because look, we have to keep in mind too, and this is one of the reasons that the income piece of the story is so important. People say, oh, well, they drive our wages down. Okay, well, our wages haven't gone down. And
Mm.
then they say, well, oh, well, they drive down the wages of low skilled workers. Okay, well, those haven't gone down either. The lower 10 and 20% of our wage distribution, they've seen some of the highest growth of anybody in the distribution over the last 30 and 40 years. So the data just does not bear that out. What the data bears out is that you get more immigration and you kind of get like a boost, or I think somebody has called it a shot in the arm for the economy. And you have a higher demand for consumer goods, you have a higher demand for food, a higher demand for other services. to accommodate those workers, and all of that combined ends up increasing wages as opposed to decreasing them.
Yeah, and in one angle on this that I guess I had heard mentioned before, but I hadn't thought about quite as much, is that when people from uh, lower wage countries come to the United States, they almost automatically become more productive,
That's right.
right? They sort of
Yeah.
become higher skilled almost by definition, right? Even if they
Yeah.
are working in, again, one of the most stereotypical examples in agricultural harvesting, um, the
Yeah.
American farms are more mechanized, that just by being
That's right.
in the United States, they
That's right.
become more American, they become more productive.
That's right.
And so the assumption that like, well, these are like low skilled or low wage people, and they'll sort of like drag America down. If anything, America sort of lifts them up.
Yeah, exactly. That's what's happened. There's a lot of evidence that this is the case. Instead of the competing piece, it's the complementary piece. And much like trade with immigration, you get a productivity enhancement. You have more people to use more capital in different ways and more pervasively. And that means that the whole society becomes more productive. And the truth of the matter is that's the only way you can get rich.
Mm. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of speaking of like the bigger pie being more creating more value, being sort of like synergistically, right? If the society gets 25% bigger, you get, 40% richer or something like that. That there
Right.
are situations in which uh, you can have that sort of growth. It reminds me of I think it was Adam Davidson, who's the guy who used to be the host of Planet Money on NPR, and then he started a company, like a podcast production company, and then he wrote a book and has done a lot of like writing about economics and business. And he wrote a book. This was sort of like right before I think the COVID hit, so late 2010s, about how if you want to succeed in the 21st century, you shouldn't try and get into like a big, wide scale commodity business, especially if you're an American. Um, you should specialize and you should be relentlessly specialized. And he has a bunch of case studies about how this works with real companies and entrepreneurs. And his point is, in an increasingly globalized world, you have a global market for lots of things, both products and services, especially any service that can be delivered over the internet. You really have a pretty low friction global market, and so it pays to specialize and have and serve niche audiences. But that's something that didn't exist before globalism, before the internet. That it if you want to make something, you're like a very specific Etsy seller, and you like want to crochet Star Wars themed crochet items, right? In any given town, there are not enough the you know that Venn diagram of people who love crochet and love Star Wars is not big enough. You only have
Right.
three customers. But
Right.
if the entire world is your customer and you can ship cheaply, you can make a full-time living star crocheting Star Wars stuff, and it can be
Mm-hmm.
great. And so that example, that sort of Adam Davidson example, I thought was interesting here. In there are non-obvious ways in which a larger, more complex economy
Mm-hmm.
creates more opportunities that
Yep.
right. It's not just an extra 3% or an extra 4% or whatever. There's whole
Right.
categories of opportunity that don't exist in
Right.
smaller, more constrained
Yeah.
examples.
Becomes more beneficial to become more specialized because you can reach so many more people and satisfy so many more people's specialized wants and needs.
And the idea that everyone, that, ideally we would have a job market where everyone finds the job that's perfect for them, right? Whatever
Uh-huh.
that is.
Uh-huh.
Um, and the
And
more granular and diverse the job market is, the tighter people can slot into what actually is good for them, right? If we only had three jobs,
uh-huh.
if it was like steel worker, cop, and ditch digger, right? A lot of us would end up with jobs we didn't really like.
Right.
But if there's
Right.
10,000 different jobs in the economy,
Right.
there's a lot more chance that
More
we'll
choice
find
and
something
more.
we actually do
That's
like.
right. That's right. That's right. Easier to match up to a specialized piece that you like. And what the populists want to do is, depending on who we're talking about, many of the populists, I should say, many of the populists want to do is implement some sort of industrial policy where they dictate, or the people in power dictate what those jobs will be. There's this fascination with manufacturing, much like there was a fascination with agriculture up until the 1920s. It's like, well, we have to go back to the world of everybody farming. Well, no, thank you. I'd rather not do that all day. And it's the same sort of thing. Those lawyers who are pushing these industrial policies for manufacturing jobs and people being on assembly lines, they're not going to be in those jobs. They don't want their kids in those jobs. So, it's against human nature. We don't have to call it socialism, but it's very similar in the sense that you have somebody directing who can do what job and what jobs are available for people. That is entirely against human nature. It is not going to work. It has never worked in history, and it will not work.
Well, yeah, I think uh, on the one hand, it seems sort of socialist because it's sort of like national economic planning, but it's also a little bit like the sort of like Italian fascism of the 20s and 30s,
Oh yeah,
which
yeah,
is, or, today, if we want to use a nicer, we would say it's corporatism, maybe,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
less emotional. But this is this old kind of like pre-World War II era
yeah,
view of economic planning, which was very popular at the time, even among some people in the United States. The idea that basically you know, the chairman of the like business federation and the chairman of the labor federation and then the representative from like the national government and their deputies sit around in a conference room once a year and together they hash everything out and they determine how many companies there will be, how many jobs there will be, what everyone will charge, what everyone will be paid, and then they all go to lunch and then everyone has to just do all that stuff for the next year until they
hmm
sit in the conference room and make update their plan.
yeah,
And that's just how economies should be run,
right,
right? Some smart, hopefully smart people decide what all the jobs should be, and then everyone just has to fall in line. But that's not, and I say this very advisedly. That's an un-American view of of how an
yes,
economy should function, but
yeah,
also not an efficient one because among other things, the people in that room they're not as smart as they think they are. They're
yeah.
not, and the most important thing is they're not taking into account what the people in the economy actually want.
No, that's right. That's right. And so and even if we avoid the full-blown plan, right? Even if we avoid planning everything, you're still butting up against the fact that some people don't want to do those things. I mean, yeah, I know lots of people who, when they grew up, their parents and grandparents said, we don't want you to have to be doing X. X was whatever they did, right?
Mm.
They wanted an easier life for them or a better life. And if people want to end up being welders or plumbers or work on a factory, like that's fine. But you can't force everybody to do it and, pretend that it's going to work out.
Well, yeah, and I wonder because, and we've talked about this on the show before with other guests as well about this is the like there's a million pop culture examples of uh, parents and grandparents with physically tough, difficult jobs, wanting their kids to be. I want you to work in an office. I want you to be a college professor. I want you to be a doctor. That's the American dream. That's the like. The dark version is uh, the Godfather, right? Where Vito Corleone tells Michael he wants him to be a governor or a senator, right? Instead of a gangster. Um, that because of that, that's all the more surprising, I think, because there's that sort of like that really long-term vibe in American culture of people with tough jobs wanting their kids to have better jobs. Um, why do we have so many sort of conservative populists? I mean, we have sort of like the lefties who have this sort of kind of Marxist cult of labor, right? And so they think that the labor with the hammer and the sickle, industrial workers are like the true, the real deal. But we have, our sort of like conservative populist friends who are like, oh no, software coding, that's not a real job. Only coal mining and steel
Yeah.
work. Those are the only two, maybe working in
Yeah.
Detroit for GM, but those are the only real serious jobs for serious minded people. Uh, and then you've got people like whether it's, Tucker Carlson or, Marco Rubio, I think maybe it's good that Marco Rubio is now Secretary of State and not Secretary of Labor or Commerce. Personally,
Yeah,
that's just
really,
me.
really.
But uh, but Rubio has talked about this a lot. I've seen him speak in person, and I think he's very uh, earnest. I mean, I think he really wants to help American workers. But this idea that like we need policy, like interventions from the government to make sure that there are these like 1950s style manufacturing jobs,
Hmm.
because otherwise there'd just be millions of American men, usually the ones who didn't go to college, they will just
Right,
be permanently unemployed forever
right.
if we don't force 50s style manufacturing jobs to keep continuing. And I just wonder, to me, that seems kind of insulting. Like it basically says, well,
It
the millions
is.
of guys that we have in mind are
Yeah.
they're just not smart enough for the
They're
21st
just
century
stupid
jobs.
and incapable of doing anything, and we have to save them. Um,
So, I mean, if you know, if
and
I was a 19-year-old and I was like, you know what, I'm not going to go to college, I want some other job, and then the person defending my interests was talking about me like that, I would be kind of annoyed.
yeah, no, and look, the data doesn't bear out that that's been the case, right? I mean, that's the thing that they don't want to talk about. The decline in manufacturing employment as a share of our economy hasn't been declining since the 70s or 80s or 90s. It's been declining since the 20s.
Mm.
And as it's been declining, everybody's been getting a lot richer, even the people who don't go to college. So it's okay. I understand you want to help people, you want to make sure people have what they need. Like, of course, that's great. I want the same thing. That's not the way to do it.
Well, yeah, and the you talk about this towards the end of the book about this long-term trend from manufacturing to what again I think maybe is confusingly for some people called the services sector, which is like almost everything else, right? So there's the people who make stuff in factories, right? Tangible objects, and then there's kind of everyone else, right? And then
Right.
farming, maybe is often segmented out
Which
in
is because it's tiny, right? It's really
statistics, which again these days, again you said is very small, um, as a total percentage of the workforce. And so, you get into this sort of confusing assumption, which is everyone thinks the service sector is just like fast food and the lowest paid version of service. Like they don't realize service sectors, most of the economy, right? Most of the jobs, including a lot of the very best paid jobs, right? Like President of the United States is part of the service sector, right? CEO of Apple is the service sector. Um,
right, right,
and 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 so when I think when people think of a factory job, they think of like maybe they think of like union benefits or reliable work or things like that. They think of like these desirable things that supposedly go with that job. Not all jobs from the olden days had those things, but that's what they
yeah,
think of. And when they think of quote service sector, they tend to think of the lowest paid
right.
service sector jobs, even though those aren't representative of that category at all.
No, that's right. That's right. There are many, many, many categories of services that exist now that didn't exist back then, that have provided an incredibly good living and still do and probably still can, going forward. It's much too narrow a look. It's much too exclusive in the sense that it's too exclusionary for too many people. And it's just the wrong way of looking at it. It's not the case that wages have been higher in manufacturing than across the board in services. It's just not the case.
And you point this out. A couple other people I've been reading recently have made a similar point, which is that the highest the highest wage manufacturing jobs, the ones in that category that pay the most, are for people who do have advanced training.
That's right. That's right.
So, so
That's right.
there are people with, if you've got a master's degree in mechanical engineering, yeah, you can get a really high paid job in the
Exactly.
world of
No,
manufacturing, but
exactly.
that's not the sort of like
The assembly line
small
guy.
town Ohio assembly line guy. Those are two
Right.
different. Yeah.
No, that's right. Very, very different. And nobody ever talks about that,
Mhm.
so yeah, no, there's a lot more to get in there, but I do get into it in the book. So I hope people will check it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to, as we wrap up here, point out the data. So again, this book has a lot of data and a lot of data analysis, which I think is, uh, a set of numbers on their own can't always tell you what the like most ethically or morally correct thing to do is. But when it comes to making public policy, you usually start with accurate data. So I think that's important. So the data, and you note, sorry, at the very beginning, a lot of this, very long, multi-decade data sets only go up to sort of like the beginning of the COVID era. And rather to the present moment. And that this was always the thing when I worked at the Tax Foundation. We used to publish these reports all the time. They were like annual updates with statistics, and it was 2012, and we would be showing people a report, and then the latest data line was from 2010, and people would say, "Well, why
Yeah.
isn't it from 2012?" I'm like,
Why?
"Well,
Right.
the year's only half over, so."
It's gonna take a
um,
while.
but also the data, the sources these data come from, which often government databases, are a year or two or more calendar years behind the current year in terms of crunching the numbers and actually presenting them. So
Right.
one, the data in this book couldn't possibly have gone up to 2025 because that's not how data works.
Right.
But as you point out, some of these longer term trends were there was a sort of exogenous shock of
There
COVID,
was a break.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That would have made, including like those last, like 2021, 22, would have sort of messed up with the 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 realistic implications that we can draw from these trend lines. And
Right.
so it's actually more honest not to include the last couple years.
Yeah.
Um, but all of that is just to lead up to the actual question, which is how long how long do we have to like slog through this sort of kind of post-COVID world before you think we have enough data to create a new kind of normalized kind of equilibrium where we can say
Yeah.
what have the like workforce and employment trends been from 2019 until when?
I think we're getting back there now. I mean, I think every single data source is not completely up to date yet, but in some of the writings that we've done, me and my colleagues at Cato in the last year, mostly on our blog posts, um, maybe a couple of other places, but we've sort of started to incorporate where we can 23, 24, not 25 yet. But so you can see a lot of trends coming back. So you can see there's just a clear, oh wait, there was this dip, this shock. All right, now we're back. And that's all starting to work out now. We're going to end up with another possibly huge shock with this tariff stuff, but we'll have to see how that goes.
Well, yeah, I just think that it's sort of fascinating because again, the sort of, I think, a normal person assumption is like, well, you want to data as much as possible. You don't want to leave anything out. But
Yeah.
the context is important. I know one of the ones, there's probably 100 examples you could give, but one of the ones that sort of pops into my mind is during COVID, during 2020, when we had a bunch of layoffs, a lot of people in the lower wage section of the service sector got laid off in places like restaurants and hotels. Um, and so that meant that the average wages of people who were employed actually went up significantly, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you could say, oh, great, wages are up. But of course, that would be ignoring the context and would be the wrong
Right.
assumption to pull. So there's
Right.
there's there's a reason why you sometimes you sort of like present a data set in a certain way. Uh, well, Norbert, thank you so much for being with us. This has been fascinating.
You're welcome.
Um,
Thank
Again,
you.
great book, Crushing Capitalism. All our listeners and viewers should rush out and pay full price for this book right now, um, and
Thank you, Richard.
post those Goodreads reviews. Uh, and before we sign out, Norbert, where should people go to find all of your excellent work and commentary?
If you go to cato.org and type in my name, find it all.
And are you also still posting on Twitter/X?
Oh yeah, I am. I think it's Norbert J. Michel or something like that, but I don't even know. But you can find me on Twitter. But if you go to the Cato page and find me there, you can get to the Twitter page, and find the Forbes stuff and all of that. So
Yeah, follow
that's
him on
that's it.
LinkedIn. He's a great guy. All right. Thanks, Norbert, for being with us.
Thanks so much, Richard. I appreciate it.